Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for another Breakfast with Blaha. And today I'm having steamed vegetables and grilled chicken breast. Don't worry, I'll be getting sick of this soon and I'll rotate it. Actually got a bunch of steak piled up and a bunch of yogurt, but I do want to get through the chicken that I have. Over to the point, let's talk a little bit about lifting heavy and hypertrophy, because I'll get a lot of people who will say, hey Jason, I don't see the point in lifting heavy if my goal is hypertrophy. There's plenty of studies showing really high reps with light weight build muscle, and the problem is that that's not entirely true. Okay, not entirely true. There are caveats and points of contention with all that, and I mean basically I'm just going to quote evidence-based people on this at this point. I'm not even going to stick with anyone who's bro. We'll look at people purely who are evidence-based. And I'll jump into some of the winning stuff last. But if you look at guys like Lyle McDonough, Mental Hanselman, so those of you who are evidence-based, you know these names. They have both pointed out that there is the possibility in some data, and definitely anecdote, showing that the really high rep work may not actually be real hypertrophy. Okay? May not be real hypertrophy. A lot of it is the potential to be sarcoplasmic growth, which is technically muscle growth, not as lasting as myofibrillar growth. I've also seen guys like Henselman point out that even for bodybuilders, that if you build similar amounts of muscle mass using really high reps versus lower reps with heavier weight, that you look harder, and it seems to have to do with these ratios. That it may seem to have to do with that. Also have the fact that a lot of it is transient. And that's one of the problems with some of these studies, and you've seen these people specifically criticize some of these really high rep metabolite studies or MRI studies, is that they pointed out that what we know is some of the swelling you get from this training, that it's temporary and it'll be gone in a couple weeks. But if you only are waiting a week to do an MRI, you may be picking up muscle growth, but perceiving it as muscle growth when it's really just swelling of the muscle. It's temporary. So in other words, all of the really high rep work that you're doing, even if you spent 12 weeks or 20 weeks doing it, might actually, most of it might disappear within 2 weeks. It might be gone within 2 weeks. So all that work. So there's that to consider. That's a problem. Because we're not getting real muscle growth from it. And some of that, the difference, you guys see the difference. You see certain bodybuilders, even when they're really lean, some look harder than others, some look puffier than others. There is, obviously, substances can be involved with that, but there's also, training style does seem to matter there. Just something people have noted. It does seem to matter for those guys. So again, it's not necessarily real functional muscle that you're getting. That's part of our problem. Number two, we come over to, as again some of them have pointed out, it fades quicker. Muscle that you seem to gain from higher reps when you detrain seems to drop off much faster. And when I say much faster, we're talking not small difference, not double. We are talking enormously faster. That in other words, muscle that you build from really, really heavy training sometimes sits there for a year after you quit working out. You lose a lot of it, but you have a much higher starting base again as soon as you start back up lifting. It stays longer. Something that's been noted for strength athletes and people who strength train, that muscle sticks around a lot longer when they retire and quit training hard. When you look at the pure bodybuilding type training, a lot of those guys, you look at some of these pro bodybuilders, as soon as they come off all the stuff and they quit training, how many of them look like they never worked out within a couple years? Go through and look. Just go look at a lot of before and afters. There are plenty of well-known pro bodybuilders who just look like 150-pound skinny guys today. And I'm talking not even 150 with abs, they're just skinny guys. They look like they never touched a weight. So this is a factor for keeping it. And I've had Winning say the same thing. And he's pointed out that when it comes to that myofibrillar growth, that max work and speed work seems to really help solidify it the best, right? So if you're going to do the higher rep work also, because I do some of it, right? I do it. I use restoration work. I do really high rep work for some stuff, 30, 50 reps on my off days. That if you're doing the really heavy work too, it seems to solidify all of it better. But in particular, he noted that max work, people who max a lot, and people who do dynamic work, because again, these very, very high output, low burst, seem to get muscle that sticks around much longer. And his hypothesis is that is because it's the better myofibrillar growth, right? He thinks that's the case. And so here's what we find is that if you're going to do any of this pump work, you need to lift heavy with it. Because if you don't, it's very fleeting, it's temporary. It fades very, very quickly. And if you do heavy lifting with it, it tends to stay longer. Also, keep in mind the potential for more overall growth in general, right? Because we're using these multiple modalities. So even if a person says, well, I don't care if a lot of it's temporary, I want it, so they do all the pump work. But you have a different growth stimulus from the heavier work to go with it. Ideally, if you wanted to get really as big as possible and care about all these types of growth, you would benefit from doing really heavy training and then doing pump work after. And traditionally, that's always been done, and it's always worked, and that has always been a successful strategy. Right? It's always been a successful strategy, particularly for guys not on stuff. Right? If you're drug free, usually the biggest guys tend to be the strongest guys, and there's an overlap between absolute strength from lifting heavy, carrying over to your work capacity, and the work capacity building into other hypertrophy. There's a synergy between the two that seems to exist. Right? There's a synergy between the two that seems to exist for purposes of gaining muscle. And a lot of times those things get lost when people only care about size, or they're willing to put enough stuff into their body that they kind of get some shortcuts around all of that. But at the end result is that it fades faster. They're not keeping a lot of it as long. It's easier to lose it. And that's not what anyone wants either. I mean, if you're going to put in all this work, realistically it makes sense to make it stay as long as possible. Also makes sense to just get strong and build your work capacity and be better, right? Being able to produce more force, it makes you more athletic, stronger, more useful. It's just a good idea to do that because you're getting other benefits besides, well, I only care about hypertrophy, but in that context, that's because these people think that they're going to get more by only caring about it. And in this case, you may actually get more by lifting really heavy with it together, and you're going to keep it longer. It's going to be easier to maintain. But again, they're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking of just the short term. How can I get as much muscle as quickly as I can and not care if it's gone in a year? Because they're not thinking in those terms. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.